The silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic screech. A strange sound echoed across the Nevada desert test field, coming from the Goliath X-1 just seconds before everything went downhill. The tank, the pride of the U.S. Army, the symbol of a decade of research and lofty promises, locked up in the middle of a critical maneuver. Its wheels spun without command. The cannon turned in the opposite direction it was supposed to, and the sensors, which were supposed to calculate everything in real time, went blind. Red alerts flashed across the monitoring screens. Controllers shouted out emergency codes, and for a few seconds, the country's most powerful land combat machine became a runaway beast. No one was hurt, but the embarrassment was total. Intelligence officers, DARPA engineers, Pentagon reps, they were all there, and they all saw it. The most ambitious military project in years had failed right in front of the most important eyes in national security. What no one knew yet was that this failure had an echo, a distant one, a mistake with a name, a date, and a scar. 300 miles away, the sun beat down on the dented tin roof of Frank Delaney's workshop. He calmly wiped down the blades of an old hydraulic engine, leaning against a John Deere tractor that had stopped working 2 days earlier. His hands, marked by calluses, grease, and a precision you don't learn in trade school, moved with ease. "The problem's not in the shaft," he murmured to himself. "It's the lateral vibration in the structure. When it heats up, it shifts 3 millimeters and jams the sensor." The farmer beside him, sweating in silence, widened his eyes when the engine roared back to life. Frank simply nodded, walked over to the concrete sink, and slowly washed his hands. His eyes followed the water as it ran, while the past still pulsed in his chest. Because deep down, he knew. Too much tech, not enough listening. He'd said that once, and paid a heavy price for it. The small town where Frank lives is all but forgotten, surrounded by dry brush and hot winds. He stays in the back of a metal warehouse, sharing the space with old parts and boxes labeled by hand. On the wall, faded photos show him younger, in uniform, standing next to an armored vehicle. In another, he offers a modest smile beside a group of soldiers. But beneath the floorboards, inside a locked box, lies the headline that marked his downfall. The military news clipping accusing him of sabotaging an army project back in 2001. He was the one who had tried to warn about structural issues in an experimental tank that used sensors similar to the ones now in play. No one listened, and when the system failed, he was blamed for technical sabotage and discharged. No court ever truly heard him. No engineer reviewed his notes. The order came from the top, and since then the name Franklin Delaney has been erased from all official records. But not everything disappears. The morning after the Goliath X-1's collapse, an emergency meeting is held at Central Command. The technical report shows no logical errors. Every module works fine on its own. The AI runs without learning issues. But once they're integrated, the system crashes. One of the older veterans in the room, retired Colonel James Halverson, scans the report and mutters something nobody wants to hear. This has happened before. The room falls silent. He mentions the year, the project, the name, and a tech who had warned about harmonic interference, confusing the sensors under thermal stress. Most people in the room had never heard of him, but someone scribbles down the name, Delaney, Franklin Delaney. Across the country, as Frank brews a pot of strong coffee, a discreet military vehicle rolls down the dirt road to his property. A young lieutenant steps out with firm strides but hesitant eyes. She hadn't expected someone so ordinary. A man in a worn-out t-shirt and scuffed boots. But it was him, the man they were looking for. "Mr. Delaney?" she asks. He doesn't answer right away. He looks at the sky, then at her. Depends on who's asking. She introduces herself, explains what happened, shows him a photo, the Goliath. And finally, she says the one sentence that changes everything. "They said you're the only one who can make sense of what's happening." Frank closes the door without a word. But inside, he grabs his old toolbox, locks up the shop, and stares at his reflection in the window. He's no longer a soldier, no longer an engineer, but that sound, the one the Goliath made, he's heard it before, and he knows exactly what it means. If this story already got you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is even more thrilling. The military aircraft crossed the sky with the heavy hum of something carrying more than it should. Frank Delaney hadn't said a word since boarding. He sat by the window, arms crossed like trying to relax might somehow be a trap. The young lieutenant across from him, Jenkins, kept her eyes fixed on the folder in her hands. Inside it was more than just reports. It held the entire past of a man the Army had preferred to forget, and now was scrambling to reinstate. No apology. No attempt to make things right. Just urgency. And need. "Why now?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse and dry, already knowing the answer. She took a breath. "Because no one can figure out what's going wrong. And you've seen this before." He didn't reply. Just leaned his forehead against the fuselage, listening to the engine's rumble. Once again, he was being dragged back to a place he swore he'd never set foot in again. When they arrived at Fort Carver's advanced base in the Arizona desert, the welcome was anything but warm. Officers hurried past without meeting Frank's eyes. Engineers whispered to each other. To them, that gray-bearded man with a worn-out backpack looked like he didn't belong. A museum piece, dragged back out of desperation. The base commander, General Vera Hargrove, got straight to the point. "We're stuck. We've run the Goliath X-1 system over 80 times. In the lab, everything checks out. But in the field, the failure keeps happening. Always during the same maneuver." Frank stayed silent. She handed him a tablet filled with technical data. He scanned graphs, thermal maps, frequency charts. Nothing surprised him. Internal temperature spikes 10 degrees above normal during acceleration. Vibration starts in Sector C, then spreads to the AI core. "Are you listening to the tank?" Everyone in the room stared at him. "Listening?" one of the engineers scoffed. "We analyze. We don't listen to machines. We interpret data." Frank handed the tablet back. "Maybe that's the problem." They took him to the test hangar. And there it was, the Goliath X-1, a massive hulk of dull steel and sharp lines, parked like a sedated beast. The tank had external sensors, short antennas, onboard AI, and a thermal dampening system. But to Frank's eyes, it all looked too familiar, like an old mistake had been recycled, just wrapped in new software. He circled the machine, running his hand along its side like recognizing a former adversary. "You reinforce the front armor, but forgot that vibration builds up down below, where no one's paying attention. You're trying to tame a monster without listening to what it's telling you." An awkward silence filled the hangar. A young engineer in a spotless lab coat crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Mr. Delaney, your methods are outdated. This tank runs on AI. We don't listen to engines. We read algorithms." Frank stepped closer. "Is that the same arrogance that almost got 3 soldiers killed in yesterday's simulation?" In the back of the hangar, sitting on a workbench, an older technician had been quietly watching. Ernie Valdez, an old colleague of Frank's, and one of the few who still remembered the real story. They shook hands firmly. "I thought you'd never come back here." Frank offered a faint smile. "Me too." Ernie reached under the bench and handed Frank his old mechanical stethoscope. "I held on to this, just in case you ever returned." Frank gripped the instrument like reclaiming a lost part of himself. "You think they'll let me use this?" "They don't need to let you. They just need to see." That night, in a makeshift dorm, Frank sat alone in the dark, reviewing old reports while the base slept. Jenkins brought him coffee, and a question that had clearly been weighing on her. "Is it true they discharged you without even letting you defend yourself?" Frank nodded slowly. "They needed someone to blame, fast, and I was inconvenient. I said what they didn't want to hear, about how sensors could fail from something as simple as a vibrating structure's sound. It was too new for them to understand, and I was too old to stay quiet." She sat silently. For the first time, she saw more than a tarnished record. She saw scars and wisdom. The next day, Frank asked for one single test, a simple acceleration run on an open track, with the sensors active and the hull exposed to heat. Everyone was skeptical, but General Hargrove approved it. "If anything looks risky, we shut it all down," she warned. Frank nodded. "It's going to fail again, but this time, you'll be listening." The tank was rolled into position. The entire base watched. Tension hung in the air. The engine fired up. Heat climbed. The chassis began to tremble. And then, that same sound. Faint, subtle, but unmistakable. Frank, eyes closed, holding the stethoscope against the tank's side, murmured, "Same frequency, same pattern, same warning." But before he could finish the sentence, A red light flashed on the control tower's panel. One of Goliath's internal systems had locked up on its own, and for the first time, everyone saw it for themselves. The problem wasn't in his head. A tense silence filled the hangar after the latest shutdown of the Goliath X1. No one dared to speak. The monitors still blinked red with warning signs. The technicians exchanged uneasy glances. The engineering team, once confident and dismissive, now looked fragile. Frank Delaney took 2 steps back from the tank, removed the stethoscope from his ears, and gently ran his hand across the armored shell, like trying to calm a wounded creature. "It's trying to warn you, but you forgot how to listen." His voice was calm, almost quiet, but the words echoed like thunder in the metallic space. General Hargrove stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on Frank. "Do you know what's causing this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the workbench, grabbed a piece of paper, and began to sketch. Resonance waves, tension accumulation points, friction zones. It's physical, not logical. The hull's vibration hits resonance when the temperature goes over 250 degrees. That disrupts the AI's quantum sensors. The tank's brain freezes because its body is screaming. But no one's listening. Chief Engineer Jeremy Lott, who had previously mocked him, now seemed far less sure of himself. "We have internal acoustic sensors. They didn't detect anything." Frank met his gaze directly. Those sensors were calibrated to ignore internal noise unless it suggested structural damage. But the flaw killing the Goliath is that mechanical whisper. He asked for a full internal layout of the tank, then pointed to 3 spots near the engines where the vibrations clustered. "You've built a resonance chamber without realizing it. The Goliath's reinforced armor is bouncing the vibration back inward. It's like yelling in a cave. The AI loses its mind." From that moment, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted. Frank was no longer treated like an outsider. He had become the center of the operation. Technicians began documenting his instructions. Jenkins organized the data. The old stethoscope was no longer a relic. It was respected as a critical tool. Still, to Frank, the change felt strange. Part of him just wanted to fix the problem and go home. Another part still carried hurt and fear. In the workshop, Frank requested simple materials. "I need 3 sheets of flexible titanium, an old set of harmonic dampers, sound-absorbing foam, and a heat blower." The younger techs frowned. "That's stuff used for building maintenance." Frank simply nodded. "Skyscrapers use harmonic dampers so they don't collapse in the wind. This is just a skyscraper on treads." Valdez chuckled from the back. He always had these weird comparisons, but he's never been wrong. As the materials were gathered, Frank pulled a small, worn-out notebook from his pocket. Old notes, technical sketches, formulas from his Army days. "Everything you're trying to figure out now, I wrote down in here 24 years ago. No one wanted to see it." Jenkins watched in silence. For the first time, she realized she wasn't looking at some has-been clinging to old theories. She was looking at a man who held an entire generation's worth of rejected knowledge in his hands. Over the next few hours, the team, now fully under Frank's guidance, began retrofitting the Goliath. In the areas he identified, they installed the makeshift dampers. One by one, soldiers and engineers took turns fine-tuning the setup. Every detail was measured with care. Every component installed like more than a machine was at stake. It was about listening, about redemption, about the humility to admit that modern technology can't hear, unless it's taught to listen. As day turned into night and the tank was sealed up again, Frank stood silently by the hatch. Valdez brought him a bottle of water. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back in this place." Frank answered quietly, but with conviction. "Me neither, but I couldn't let this happen again. A broken machine can destroy a battalion, but a lie, it destroys an entire generation's trust." Jenkins entered the hangar with new intel. A special inspection team from the Pentagon would arrive the next day. The Goliath would undergo one final test. And now, everything rested on a blind shot. Either the machine would perform, or the entire project would be scrapped. And with it, maybe Frank's name. Again. That night, alone in his bunk, Frank held his old notebook open, staring at formulas no one had wanted to hear before. And for the first time in years, he felt afraid. Afraid he might be wrong. afraid he was watching history repeat itself. Afraid that even if people are finally listening, maybe no one knows what to do with the truth. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the hangar lights flicker on. The Goliath is ready, and someone has to be inside it. The entire hangar was silent, like no one dared to breathe before the right moment. The Goliath X1 was ready, sealed, recalibrated. Its internal components had been modified using a solution that looked like it had come out of an 80s manual. But no one could argue with the results anymore. Outside, soldiers, technicians, and engineers watched every detail with growing tension. The sun was just starting to rise on the horizon, casting an orange glow across the tank's grey hull. It was as if the day itself hesitated to begin, waiting to see what would happen next. Frank Delaney, his flight suit zipped to the neck, walked toward the tank. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a silent medal. He passed officers and techs without making eye contact, not out of pride, but because he knew that at that moment, any sign of doubt would only add to the weight. Jenkins caught up with him just a few steps before the hatch. "Are you sure you want to do this yourself?" Frank stopped. His eyes were calm, but steady. "I've been inside this machine since before it existed. If something goes wrong, better it happens to me." Jenkins gave a slow nod. There was respect in her silence, and admiration, even if she didn't quite know how to show it yet. Inside the Goliath's cockpit, everything was stark, minimalist. The control interface displayed layers of data Frank didn't recognize. Embedded AI, dynamic mapping, neural telemetry, terms that sounded like another language. But the sounds he knew. He sealed the hatch, took a deep breath, and pressed the stethoscope against the inner wall. The engine hadn't started yet. The silence inside was total, and that's why he could feel it. There was no room for error. One misread noise and it could all go wrong again. One out-of-phase signal, and that steel shell would become a trap. Up in the control tower, General Hargrove watched the monitors with her arms crossed. Engineer Lott, now a far cry from the man he was days ago, made final adjustments to the monitoring system. Jenkins narrated each stage for the Pentagon inspectors who had arrived in the early hours of the morning. Everyone knew. This test wasn't just technical. It was political. It was historic. And it was personal. The engine roared to life with a deep growl. The initial vibration was minimal. The Goliath began to move slowly, just entering the first few meters of the test track. Frank gripped the controls tightly, like he was holding onto the memory of everything he'd lived through. The inner mechanisms purred. The heat started to rise. The hull began to warm. And with the heat came the vibration. He closed his eyes, listened, measured with his ears. And he knew. It was different. Control. This is Delaney. Frequency has held steady for the past 120 seconds. No system errors. Requesting clearance for maneuver sequence. The reply took a moment, but it came. "You're cleared." The Goliath picked up speed, entered the sharp turn, the same maneuver that had caused the failure in previous tests. The critical moment. Heat sensors lit up on the panel. Frank leaned slightly forward. He heard a new sound, subtle, a minor variation, but this time, nothing locked up. No alarms, no crash. The tank responded exactly as it should. The AI stayed on course. The wheels obeyed. The sensors corrected in real time. For the first time, man and machine were moving in harmony. In the tower, the room erupted with contained reactions. Jenkins covered her mouth with her hand. Lott spun his chair around, speechless. General Hargrove took a step forward, eyes glued to the monitor. "He's making it work," she whispered. One of the military inspectors looked at her and asked quietly, "Who is that man?" Frank continued the test. Turns, sudden stops, full speed acceleration. He repeated every movement that had once triggered a critical failure. But now, the Goliath responded like never before. It was as if the machine had finally learned how to breathe. After 27 minutes of continuous operation, he brought the tank back to its original position and parked it. The hatch opened with a quiet hiss. Frank stepped out slowly, drenched in sweat. The base stood still, but something was in the air. Something that felt like relief and reverence. The general was the first to approach. It worked. Against all odds, it worked. Frank simply removed the stethoscope from his neck and handed it to her. It wasn't the tank that changed. It was the way you chose to listen. She took the instrument gently, as if holding a key or a mirror. But before she could say another word, one of the inspectors stepped forward with a folder in hand. "Mr. Delaney, you've just revived a program that was on the verge of being shut down. And in doing so, you've changed the course of modern ground defense." He opened the folder. "This is a formal offer. We want you as the Goliath X1's technical director. Full autonomy, your own team, chief advisor pay, and most importantly, your name will be cleared, publicly." Frank looked at the documents, then glanced around. Young technicians, engineers now humbled, soldiers watching with curiosity. And then, his eyes landed on Jenkins. She was holding his notebook, explaining, pointing, teaching something to 3 other officers. He took a deep breath, and in that moment, he knew. This might be the hardest decision of all. It was just past noon when Frank Delaney stepped into the private room on base to meet with General Hargrove. On the metal table lay the official offer, a lifetime position, his own technical team, full access to future generations of the Goliath project, and more than anything, his name cleared. The Army would formally acknowledge the mistake made 24 years ago. He'd be reinstated with full honors, his record rewritten. Everything they had taken from him, his voice, his status, his reputation, was now being handed back. But as he opened the folder and calmly flipped through the pages, Frank seemed increasingly distant from that promise of redemption. "This is important," he said without looking up. "But the most important part already happened out there." The general studied him carefully. "You know what you're turning down, don't you?" He nodded. "I do. And I also know what it would mean to accept." She stayed quiet, giving him space. "For 2 decades, I lived with anger. At everyone. At myself. When I came back here, I thought I wanted to prove something, to show I was right. But in the end, what moved me the most was watching a young lieutenant teach 3 engineers how to listen to an engine with a notebook full of handwritten notes." He closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I've already done what needed to be done. The system that broke me isn't the system I want to fix." Out in the corridor, walking back toward the hangar, Frank crossed paths with Engineer Lott. This time there was no trace of arrogance in his eyes, only humility. "Delaney, thank you, not just for the Goliath, but for showing us that sometimes the problem isn't in the code. It's in the mind of the person who thinks they know everything." Frank nodded. "Not listening is the most sophisticated kind of ignorance, and it's expensive." Lott offered his hand, and they shook. No more words, none needed. Outside the base near the test shed, Valdez was waiting with the old maintenance truck, the same one Frank used at his workshop. It was spotless, polished. A note was taped to the window with electrical tape. It read, "A hero isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who listens the deepest. Goliath Tech Team." Frank smiled. For the first time in a long time, there was no weight behind that smile. Just a quiet peace, like something inside him had been repaired too. Back in his hometown, weeks later, Frank's workshop looked different, more organized, and now regularly visited by young folks from around the region, eager to learn. He was no longer the engine nut. He was the man who heard what no one else did. Hanging modestly on one wall was the mechanical stethoscope. Below it, a handwritten phrase, "If you really listen, the machine speaks, and so does life." One day, while sipping coffee outside his shop, his phone rang. It was Jenkins. She'd been promoted to technical officer on the Goliath project. Now leading a new research team, she called just to say, "The first thing I teach them is how to listen." Frank hung up with that same calm smile as always. In his mind, no metal clanging, no alarms, just the quiet certainty that it had all been worth it, even if only once. The phone rang again. It was Bill, the farmer. "Frank, that old tractor's coughing again. Mind taking a look?" He grabbed his wrench, tossed a rag over his shoulder, and replied naturally, "Sure thing. I'm on my way." And as he walked toward the dust under the open sky, there were no tanks, no algorithms, no command posts. Just the sound of an engine that needed to be heard, and a man who had finally returned to being himself. If this story moved you and reminded you of the value of experience, respect, and true honor, Write, respect, and honor in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss what's coming next. And now check out the video that's about to pop up on your screen. It was made especially for you.